The bus stop on Kessler Avenue didn't have a bench anymore. Someone had ripped it out months ago, metal bolts still sticking up from the concrete like broken teeth, and Elena stood next to them, because standing was better than sitting on cold ground in a coat that wasn't warm enough for what November had turned into overnight. It was 2:14 in the morning. She knew because she'd checked her phone 4 times in the last 10 minutes, and each time the battery percentage had dropped a little more, sliding toward the number where the screen would just go black and stop pretending it could help her. She had exactly $11. The bus fare downtown was $14. She had done that math 3 times already, hoping it would come out different. The way you check a bank balance twice, because maybe the first time was wrong. It wasn't wrong. It was never wrong. 11 was 11, no matter how many times she counted the crumpled bills in her coat pocket. Her shift at the diner had ended at midnight, 2 hours later than scheduled, because Marcus, the night manager, had a habit of extending shifts without asking, like the extra hours were a favor he was doing everyone, not a debt he owed them. She hadn't argued. Arguing meant fewer shifts next week, and fewer shifts meant the number in her bank account got smaller instead of bigger, and it was already smaller than it should be, smaller than rent needed it to be, smaller than the specific number her landlord had written on a yellow notice and taped to her door 9 days ago. $340. That was what she was short. Not a fortune, not nothing, either, the kind of number that sat in the middle distance, close enough to see clearly, far enough that she couldn't touch it no matter how many double shifts she picked up. She'd missed the last regular bus by 20 minutes, because a customer had spilled an entire pot of coffee across 4 tables right as she was clocking out, and leaving a mess like that for the morning shift wasn't something she was built to do, whatever it cost her. So now she was standing at a stop that served exactly 1 late-night route, the 240, and she was $14 away from getting on it. A man in a gray hoodie walked past, and she asked him, quiet, not pushy, the way she'd learned to ask things from people who owed her nothing. Do you have any change? Even a little? I just need a few dollars for the bus. He didn't stop walking, just shook his head the way people do when they've decided a question doesn't require eye contact. She asked 2 more people after that. A woman walking a dog apologized so much it almost made Elena feel guilty for asking. And a man laughed. Not cruelly exactly, just tired, and said, sorry, sweetheart, everybody's broke tonight, and kept walking like the cold was a personal insult. Elena leaned against the pole where the sign for the 240 hung slightly crooked, and did the thing she always did when the night got long enough to make her chest feel tight. She counted things. Small, useless things. Streetlights. Parked cars, the number of windows lit up in the apartment building across the street, which was 2, both on the 4th floor, both probably people who couldn't sleep for reasons that had nothing to do with bus fare. She thought about calling her sister. She got as far as pulling out her phone and looking at the contact before she put it away again. Rachel had 3 kids and a husband working double construction shifts, and a mortgage that ate everything before it hit the account. And Elena wasn't going to be the 2 a.m. phone call that made Rachel's night worse too. Some weight you just carried yourself. That was the rule she'd made for herself 2 years ago after their mother died, and she'd kept it even when it made things harder, because the alternative was becoming the sister who always needed something, and she'd rather freeze on a curb than become that. The street was empty in the particular way certain hours make a city empty, not abandoned exactly, just paused, holding its breath before the early risers started moving again. A cat crossed somewhere down the block, unbothered by any of it. Elena envied the cat. She had walked distances like this before. 6 miles wasn't impossible. It was just long and cold, and her shoes had a hole starting at the left heel that let in air like a small, persistent complaint every time her foot hit pavement. She'd survive it. She'd survived worse nights than this one, technically, if he were keeping score. Which she tried not to do, because keeping score of your worst nights was its own kind of exhausting. She started walking, not toward home exactly, just toward the direction of home, because standing still in the cold had stopped feeling like a plan and started feeling like a slow method of getting sick, and she couldn't afford to get sick, not with the yellow notice still taped to her door and Marcus cutting her hours if she called in even once. That was when the car slowed down behind her. She heard it before she saw it, tires against wet asphalt. An engine so quiet, it was almost more the absence of sound than the presence of one. She didn't turn around right away. Turning around for cars that slowed near you at 2 a.m. wasn't always the smart move, and she'd learned enough about which instincts to trust and which to ignore. The car came level with her and stopped completely. She turned then, because it wasn't slowing anymore. It had actually stopped, engine idling low, and something about the stillness of it made her curiosity outweigh the caution for exactly 1 second. It was black, long, low, the kind of car that didn't belong on Kessler Avenue at any hour, let alone this one. The windows were tinted dark enough that she couldn't see inside, not even a shape. Just her own reflection standing there in a coat that wasn't warm enough, looking smaller than she felt. The window rolled down. There was a man behind the wheel, and the first thing Elena registered wasn't his face. It was the quiet. Even with the window open, the car seemed to swallow the sound of the street instead of letting it in, like the cold and the noise both stopped at some invisible line an inch past the glass. "You're not dressed for 6 miles," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. Elena stepped back half a pace without deciding to. "I'm fine," she said, which was a lie, and she suspected he knew it was a lie the second it left her mouth, because something in his expression didn't change at all, like he'd already priced in the lie before she said it. "You asked 3 people for bus fare in the last 10 minutes. It wasn't a question. I watched you do it. That's not creepy at all," Elena said, and immediately regretted the sarcasm, because sarcasm at 2 a.m. toward a stranger in an expensive car wasn't exactly the safest instinct, but tired made her mouth move faster than her judgment. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The suggestion of one, filed away for later. "I was parked outside the pharmacy. You walked past twice." She had. She remembered now, vaguely, a car parked at the curb near the pharmacy with its lights off, and she hadn't thought anything of it because cars parked with their lights off weren't unusual on a street where half the businesses had closed for the night. "I don't need a ride," she said, which was true in the sense that accepting rides from strangers in unmarked black cars at 2 a.m. was a bad life decision by every metric she'd ever been taught, and also completely false in the sense that her feet were already numb, and 6 miles felt, suddenly, enormous. "I didn't offer one," he said. "I asked if you had fare." "I don't." "How much do you need?" Elena felt her jaw tighten. There was something about the direct-as-ness of the question that made her want to refuse it on principle, the way you refuse things you desperately want just to prove to yourself you still have a choice in the matter. "I'm not taking money from a stranger in a car at 2 a.m. No offense. None taken." He said it like he meant it, not like a placeholder phrase people use to end a conversation. He was quiet for a second, looking at her in a way that wasn't quite staring, more like reading. The way you read a page you intend to come back to. You're the one who works at the diner on 5th. The one that's open all night. That stopped her. "How do you know that?" "I've been in twice. You gave me extra creamer without asking because I looked like I hadn't slept in 2 days. A pause. "I hadn't." Elena tried to place him, and couldn't. The diner ran through hundreds of faces a week, half of them regulars, half of them ghosts who came once and vanished. And this man didn't fit into either category in her memory, which unsettled her slightly. Because she prided herself on remembering faces, it was half the job. "I don't remember you," she admitted. "I'd be surprised if you did." It wasn't a memorable interaction. Except for the creamer. There was something almost funny about that, and despite everything, despite the cold and the exhaustion and every reasonable warning bell in her head, Elena felt the corner of her own mouth twitch. "Get in," he said. "Not because you owe me anything. Because it's 4 degrees, and you have another 5 miles, and your shoes have a hole in them." Elena looked down at her shoes without meaning to, like his saying it out loud might make the hole visible in a new way. "How do you know that? You've been shifting your weight off your left foot for the last 2 minutes. That's not a cold thing. That's a wet sock thing." She almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and an exhale, tired and involuntary. "You've been watching me pretty closely for someone who claims he's not offering a ride." "I changed my mind," he said. "I'm offering now." Elena stood there a moment longer, weighing the specific arithmetic of the situation. A strange man. A strange car. Her own exhaustion. Her own cold. The specific ache that had settled into her feet somewhere around the 2nd mile she hadn't even started yet. She thought about her mother, who used to say that carefulness kept you alive, but it didn't keep you warm, and that sometimes a person had to choose which kind of safety mattered more on a given night. "If I get in this car," she said, "and you turn out to be a serial killer, I want you to know I clocked your license plate before I did it." "That's fair," he said, and there was something almost like approval in it. It's a good habit. She hadn't actually clocked the plate. She did it then, quickly, memorizing the sequence out of pure principle, and something about the fact that he didn't stop her, didn't seem bothered by it at all, tipped the scale another few degrees toward yes. She got in. The car was warm in a way that made her realize exactly how cold she'd been, warmth hitting her all at once like stepping into a different climate entirely. The interior smelled faintly of leather and something else she couldn't place. Something almost metallic, almost like old coins. Though she told herself that was probably just her imagination working overtime on adrenaline. "Where am I taking you?" he asked, pulling smoothly away from the curb. She gave him the address, her building on Ashford, the one with the broken buzzer, and the landlord who taped yellow notices to doors instead of calling first. He didn't react to the neighborhood name, no flicker of judgment, which she noticed and appreciated more than she expected to. "I'm Elena," she said, because it felt strange sitting in silence next to a man she hadn't formally introduced herself to. "KL," he said. "Just KL? For now." The drive was quieter than Elena expected, not uncomfortable, just still, the kind of silence that didn't ask to be filled. She watched the city slide past the window, streetlights turning the wet road into long orange smears, and found herself sneaking glances at KL when she thought he wasn't looking. He didn't look like anyone she'd have expected to be driving through her neighborhood at 2 a.m. His coat alone probably cost more than her rent. Dark and well cut in a way that made her own coat, patched at one elbow, feel suddenly very visible. His hands on the wheel were pale, still, almost unnaturally so, like he'd trained himself out of every unnecessary movement a long time ago. "You're staring," he said, not looking away from the road. "You're driving a car that costs more than my building," Elena said. "I'm allowed to be curious." "Fair. What do you do?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of pause that felt less like hesitation and more like someone deciding how much truth a stranger deserved. "Business. Older business. The kind that doesn't fit neatly into a sentence." That's not an answer. It's the honest version of one. He glanced at her briefly, just once, and something in his gaze made her feel, for half a second, like he was cataloging something about her she hadn't offered up. "You ask direct questions. I've had a long night. I don't have the energy to be subtle. Something like amusement crossed his face, gone as quickly as it arrived. I like that. Most people spend the whole conversation deciding what they're allowed to ask. They stopped at a red light that didn't need to exist at this hour, the street around them completely empty, and Elena used the pause to actually look at him, properly, the way you look at someone once your guard drops half an inch. Sharp jaw. Dark hair pushed back like he hadn't thought about it in hours. Something old about his eyes that she couldn't explain. A tiredness that didn't match the rest of him, like he was carrying decades instead of hours. "Why'd you actually stop?" she asked. People don't stop for strangers on Kessler at 2 in the morning. Not for good reasons anyway, because you asked 3 people for money, and all 3 of them looked straight through you like you were part of the sidewalk. His jaw tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly. I don't like watching people get looked through. Elena didn't have a response to that immediately. It landed somewhere unexpected, some place she hadn't braced for, because most of the sympathy she got from strangers came wrapped in pity, and this didn't feel like pity. It felt like something closer to anger on her behalf, controlled and quiet. But there. That's a strange thing to care about, she said eventually. For a stranger. I've had a lot of time to notice things. Noticing is easier than most people think. Caring is the part everyone struggles with. The light turned green. He drove on. Elena turned the sentence over in her head a few times, trying to decide if it meant something specific, or if he just talked like that, in careful, slightly formal loops that sounded rehearsed even when they probably weren't. "You talk like you're 100 years old," she said, half joking. Something flickered across his face, there and gone so fast she almost missed it. "Something like that," he said, and didn't elaborate, and something about the way he said it made her decide not to push. They turned onto Ashford. Her building came into view, the security light over the entrance flickering the way it had for 6 months because the landlord kept promising to fix it, and never did. Kyle pulled up to the curb and put the car in park, and for a second neither of them said anything. "Thank you," Elena said. Actually, not just the polite version, the real one. "You don't have to thank me for something that should have been normal." He looked at her, and there was something careful in it, deliberate, like he was choosing exactly how much to reveal. "You're short on rent." 9 days, you said. She hadn't said that. She'd said nothing about rent at all. "How do you know that?" "I noticed the notice on your door once, a while back. Yellow paper. Landlords use that specific shade when they mean it." He said it simply, without apology, like observing things was just a fact about him, not an invasion. "That's genuinely unsettling. I know, I'm working on that." Elena laughed despite herself, short and surprised. Working on what, exactly? Being less of a walking surveillance system? Something like that. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a card. Plain. Dark. With nothing on it but a phone number in clean, precise handwriting. If you ever need a ride. Or anything else. That's not charity, that's just a number. She took it, mostly because refusing felt like more effort than accepting, and turned it over like it might reveal something else on the back. It didn't. "I don't even know your last name," she said. "You didn't ask." "Kale what?" He looked at her for a long moment, something calculating behind his eyes, deciding, and then said, quiet and even. "Voss. Kale Voss." The name settled into the car between them like it weighed something. Elena didn't know why it felt heavier than a name should, but she filed the feeling away without examining it too closely. The way you file away most strange feelings at 2 a.m., when your body just wants sleep more than it wants answers. "Good night, Kale Voss," she said, opening the door. "Good night, Elena." A pause. Small, deliberate. "Sleep well. You've earned it." She got out. The car pulled away slowly. No screech of tires, No dramatic acceleration, just a quiet, controlled departure that felt oddly like the rest of him. Elena stood on the sidewalk and watched the taillights shrink into the dark, and it was only once she was inside, climbing the stairs to her apartment, that she realized she'd never told him her name was Elena. He'd said it before she gave it to him. The yellow notice was gone by morning. Elena noticed it the second she stepped out to leave for her shift. The door bare where the paper had been taped for 9 days, corners curling from humidity, a small, ugly reminder every time she reached for her keys. Now there was nothing. Just the door, plain, and a small manila envelope tucked half under it that hadn't been there the night before. Inside was a receipt, paid in full. Her landlord's name at the top, the amount that matched exactly what she owed down to the cent, dated that morning, 6:40 a.m. She stood in the hallway holding it for a long time, feeling something complicated rise in her chest. Not quite gratitude, not quite alarm, some uncomfortable mixture of both. She thought about calling the landlord to ask who'd paid it. She thought about calling the number on the card, still sitting on her kitchen counter where she'd left it the night before, plain and dark, Kyle Voss written nowhere on it, just digits. She didn't call. She went to work instead, because work was the one thing she understood completely, the one place where the rules were simple. Show up, do the job, get paid, go home. Mysteries about vampiric-looking strangers who paid rent notices at dawn did not fit cleanly into that structure, and Ilana had learned a long time ago that the safest thing to do with things that didn't fit was to set them carefully aside and keep moving. The diner was busy for a Tuesday, one of those days where the universe seemed to conspire toward chaos in small, specific ways. The coffee machine jammed twice. A regular sent back eggs that were exactly the way he always ordered them, and Marcus scheduled her for a double without asking again. The same casual theft of her time he always committed like it cost him nothing. She thought about the receipt the whole shift. Between orders, between refills, in the 2 minutes she got to sit in the back and eat a stale muffin standing up, because sitting felt like a luxury she hadn't earned, she kept circling back to it. Someone had paid $340 for a stranger they'd met for 15 minutes at 2 a.m. That wasn't normal generosity. That was something else. Something with an agenda underneath it. And Elena had learned not to trust generosity that came without visible strings. Except it hadn't come with strings. He hadn't asked for her number. He hadn't tried anything in the car. Hadn't lingered too long at the curb. Hadn't made the interaction feel like a transaction waiting to be collected on later. He'd just given her a card and told her to sleep well. That night, after her shift, she walked home instead of taking the bus, mostly out of habit, partly because the cold had eased slightly, and partly because walking gave her time to think without anyone watching her think. She found herself at the same stretch of Kessler Avenue where she'd stood the night before, and some instinct, some small, stupid, hopeful part of her, made her slow down near the pharmacy where he said he'd been parked. The car wasn't there. Of course it wasn't. She felt a flicker of something that surprised her with its intensity, disappointment, sharp and immediate, and she was annoyed at herself for feeling it at all. She didn't know this man. She'd spent 15 minutes in his car. Disappointment wasn't a reasonable response to an empty parking spot. She got home, made tea she couldn't really afford, but made anyway because some comforts were worth the $2, and sat at her small kitchen table with the card in front of her. She turned it over 3 times. She typed the number into her phone and stared at it without sending anything, deleted it, typed it again. Finally, she wrote, "Thank you for the rent. You didn't have to do that." The reply came faster than she expected, within 2 minutes, like he'd been waiting, though she told herself that was probably just coincidence. "I know I didn't have to." That was all. No explanation, no request for anything in return, no attempt to extend the conversation into something it hadn't earned yet. Elena stared at the screen, feeling strangely unsettled by how little he was asking of her, because in her experience, people who gave things without asking for anything back were either saints or liars, and she hadn't decided yet which category Kyle Voss fell into. She wrote back, "Can I ask why?" The reply took longer this time, nearly 10 minutes, long enough that she'd almost given up checking her phone and started washing her cup instead. "Because I watched 3 people look through you like you weren't there, and it made me angry in a way I haven't been angry in a long time. And because you clocked my license plate before you got in my car, which told me you're careful even when you're desperate, and I respect that more than you probably realize." Elena read it twice. Something about the specificity of it, the fact that he'd noticed that particular detail and thought it worth mentioning, made her chest do something complicated and unfamiliar. She wrote, "Most people would find that creepy. The noticing everything thing. I've been told that." He replied almost immediately this time, "I'm working on delivering it better." Despite herself, despite every reasonable instinct telling her that strange men who paid rent and noticed everything about her shoes and her savings account were not people you built anything with, Elena felt the corner of her mouth lift, small and involuntary, the same way it had in the car. "You're doing fine so far," she wrote back, and then, before she could second-guess it, "Coffee sometime?" "My treat, since you already covered rent." The reply came fast this time, and there was something in it, some warmth she hadn't expected from a handful of text characters. "I'd like that. Name the place. I'll be there." The place Ilana picked was small, a coffee shop 2 blocks from the diner that nobody from her work ever went to, which mattered more than she wanted to admit, because some part of her didn't want an audience for whatever this turned out to be. She got there 10 minutes early out of habit, and sat at a corner table facing the door. Another habit, one Rachel used to tease her about, always sitting where you can see who's coming. Kyle arrived exactly on time, not a minute early, not a minute late, and something about that precision matched everything else she'd noticed about him so far. He wore dark clothes again, simpler than the coat from the car, but somehow still managing to look like he belonged somewhere far more expensive than a coffee shop with mismatched chairs. "You found it okay," she said, which was a stupid thing to say, but small talk had never been her strength, especially not at 10 in the morning with a stranger she'd met begging for bus fare. "I found it fine." He sat across from her, and up close, in daylight, she noticed things the dark car hadn't shown her. The paleness of his skin wasn't just pale, it was almost translucent in places. Faint blue veins visible at his temple in a way that seemed slightly wrong, though she couldn't say exactly why. His eyes were a color she couldn't quite place, gray that shifted toward something darker depending on the light. "You look tired," Elena said, studying him. "I don't sleep much." "Insomnia?" "Something like that." He said it the same way he'd said something like that about his age in the car, a phrase that closed a door gently instead of slamming it, leaving just enough room for curiosity without inviting more questions. Elena noticed the pattern and decided, for now, to let it be. They ordered. He got black coffee and didn't drink much of it, mostly just held the cup, turning it slightly between his hands like the warmth mattered more than the contents. Elena got her usual, too much sugar, and drank half of it before she said anything else. "So," she said. Kyle Voss. Older business that doesn't fit in a sentence. What's the short version? The short version is I manage things. Properties, mostly. Some financial interests. Enough that Ashford and Kessler and everywhere in between falls under things I pay attention to. Even if most of it happens without me being visibly involved. That's still not really an answer. It's the version that's true and doesn't take 3 hours to explain. Something in his expression suggested he wasn't fully joking. Ask me something else. Something smaller. Alana considered him for a moment. Why me? Genuinely, you could have stopped for anyone. There's people asking for change on every corner in this city on any given night. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup slowly. I've driven past a lot of people asking for things on a lot of corners, he said finally. I don't stop for most of them. I'm not going to pretend that's a virtue. It's just true. So what was different? You didn't ask like you expected anyone to say yes. He looked at her directly then. Careful, precise, the same way he'd looked at her in the car when he noticed the hole in her shoe. Most people who ask strangers for money brace for the rejection before it happens, you could see it in their shoulders. You asked like you already knew the answer and were just going through the motion because the alternative was worse. That's not desperation exactly. It's something closer to exhaustion. I recognized it. Elena felt something tighten in her throat, unexpectedly, at being seen that clearly by someone who'd known her for less than a full day. That's a very specific thing to notice about a stranger. I notice specific things. It's a habit I can't really turn off. A pause. It used to bother people. I've learned to warn them early instead of letting it become a surprise later. Consider me warned. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Can I ask you something else? And you can say no. Ask, are you in some kind of trouble? The car, the money, showing up out of nowhere. It reads like someone running from something, or hiding something, or both. Something crossed his face, quick and complicated, gone before she could fully name it. I'm not running from anything, he said slowly. What I'm hiding is more complicated than trouble. It's closer to just being careful about which parts of myself I show people, and when. That's very mysterious for a guy who buys coffee at 10 a.m. On a Tuesday, the almost smile appeared again, the one from the car, small and reluctant like it cost him something to let it show. I'm aware of how it sounds. They talked for almost 2 hours after that, longer than either of them seemed to plan for, about smaller things. Safer things. She told him about the diner, about Marcus and his casual theft of her hours, about her sister Rachel and the 3 kids and the mortgage that ate everything. He listened the way she wasn't used to being listened to, without checking his phone, without visibly waiting for his turn to talk, just present in a way that made her forget, for stretches at a time, that she barely knew him. He told her almost nothing concrete about himself. But somehow the conversation didn't feel one-sided, because what he did offer, he offered carefully, deliberately, like he was choosing each piece with the same precision he'd used to notice the hole in her shoe. When they finally left, standing outside in the thin morning light, he said, I'd like to see you again. Not because of the rent, or the ride. Just because I'd like to. Elena looked at him for a long moment, weighing every reasonable warning bell still sounding faintly in the back of her mind, and found that none of them were loud enough anymore to outweigh the simple, uncomplicated fact that she wanted to say, yes. Okay, she said. Yes, Kyle took her to the house on the 3rd week, though house was the wrong word for it. And Elena knew that the moment the car turned through iron gates at the end of a road she'd driven past 100 times without noticing they were there. You own this, she said, not really a question. My family has owned it a long time. He didn't elaborate on how long, and she'd learned by now not to push on the specific edges of his sentences, the places where he trailed off deliberately. The building itself was old in a way that didn't match the city around it, stone where everything else was glass and steel, ivy climbing one wing like it had been there since before the street had a name. Elena stepped out of the car and stood for a moment just looking up at it, feeling small in a way that wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar. It's a lot, she said. It's too much, most days. Something dry in his voice. I've thought about selling it more than once. I never do. Inside, a woman met them in the hallway. Human, warm-skinned, dark hair pulled back neatly, wearing the kind of calm, efficient expression that suggested she'd worked here a long time and had stopped being surprised by anything Kyle did years ago. "This is Marguerite," Kyle said. "She runs the house, has for longer than I'd like to admit, because it makes me feel old saying the number out loud." 15 years, Marguerite said, extending a hand to Elena, her grip firm and warm. "And he says that like it embarrasses him." "It doesn't. He just doesn't like being reminded that time moves for the rest of us." Elena caught something in the exchange, a familiarity closer to old friends who'd stopped pretending otherwise. "You've known him a long time. Long enough to know he's not what people whisper about him," Marguerite said, glancing at Kale with something like fondness. "Long enough to know the whispering usually says more about the people doing it than about him." "What do people whisper?" Elena asked, looking between them. Marguerite's expression flickered, just slightly, toward Kale, checking something. Permission, maybe, and he gave the smallest nod, barely a movement. "That he's dangerous," Marguerite said simply. "That the money doesn't come from anywhere ordinary. That he's been the same age for longer than anyone should be able to explain." She said it plainly, without drama, like reciting a weather report. None of it's wrong exactly. It's just missing the parts that matter. Elena looked at Kyle. He was watching her carefully, the same careful precision from the car, waiting to see how she'd respond to information delivered sideways instead of directly. "Is that true?" she asked. "The age thing." "Some of it," he said quietly. "Which parts?" He didn't answer immediately. Marguerite excused herself with practiced timing, disappearing down a corridor and leaving them alone in the entrance hall, high ceilings swallowing the space above them, a fireplace unlit at the far end despite the chill. "I'm not entirely what I've let you assume," Kale said finally. "I wanted to tell you slowly, properly, not standing in a hallway 10 minutes after you arrived. Tell me what? That I'm not as young as I look, not by a significant margin." He held her gaze, careful, steady, that the things Marguerite calls whispers are mostly true, and the reason I stopped that night on Kessler wasn't just sympathy. "I've watched this city change more times than most people would believe, and I recognized something in you I don't see often anymore." Elena felt something cold move through her chest. Not fear exactly, something more complicated. Curiosity braided tightly with unease. "How old?" she asked. "Is not as young as you look." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing the answer the way he weighed everything, carefully, like a man used to consequences following his words. "Older than this house," he said. "Older than the city, in the shape it's in now." Elena didn't say anything for a moment. The fireplace sat cold and unlit, and somewhere in the house a clock ticked, steady, unhurried, and she thought, absurdly, that even the silence in this place felt different from ordinary silence. Heavier, older. "You're not joking," she said finally. "I don't joke about this. I've learned not to." Something vulnerable crossed his face then. Brief, unguarded, gone almost as fast as it appeared. "I wasn't going to tell you today. I was going to wait longer, ease into it. But you're standing in my house asking direct questions, and I promised myself a long time ago I wouldn't lie to someone who asks me directly." "What are you?" Elena asked. Quiet now, the question smaller than she expected it to feel once it left her mouth. Kael held her gaze, and something in his stillness, the same stillness she'd noticed in the car, the same controlled economy of movement, suddenly made a different kind of sense. "Vampire," he said simply. For a very long time now, Elena waited for the fear to arrive, the way you wait for pain after a fall, bracing for the delayed sharpness of it, It didn't come, not the way she expected. What came instead was quieter, a strange settling, like several small unexplained details from the last 3 weeks finally clicking into a shape that made sense. The paleness. The coldness of his hands in the car. The way he never quite finished a cup of coffee, holding it more for the ritual than the drinking. The way he'd known her name before she gave it. "You should be more frightened than you look," Kael said, watching her face carefully, reading it the way he read everything. "I'm getting there," Elena admitted. "Give it a minute." Something almost like relief moved through his expression, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked less composed, less careful, like a man who'd been holding his breath through an entire conversation and had only just remembered to exhale. "Ask whatever you need to ask," he said. "I'd rather answer badly than not at all." "Okay," Elena said slowly, still standing in the cold, unlit hallway of a house older than the city around it. "Let's start with the easy ones." "Easy ones," Kael repeated, and something in his voice suggested he doubted her definition of easy, but he gestured toward the sitting room anyway, an invitation rather than a command, and Elena followed him in. The room was warmer than the hallway, a fire already lit, though she hadn't seen anyone tend it, 2 chairs angled toward the flames, and she sat in one without waiting to be told which was hers. He took the other, not too close, leaving the same careful distance he'd left in the car the first night, like closeness was something he offered in increments, never all at once. "Do you sleep at all?" she asked. "Rarely, a few hours. Sometimes, more out of habit than need." He watched the fire instead of her while he answered, the same way he had in the car, like some truths were easier to say sideways. "I don't dream the way you do. I don't think I've dreamed in a very long time." "Do you eat?" "Not the way you mean." A pause, precise, considered. "I drink. Rarely, and never from anyone unwilling, and never here, in this house, where you'd have to see it. I have arrangements. Old ones. Nobody suffers for it." Elena turned that over, feeling the specific weight of it settle without quite deciding how she felt yet. "That's a very careful sentence. I've had a long time to make sentences careful." Something dry entered his voice. "It matters to me that you don't picture something out of a bad film." "It isn't that. What is it then? Necessary. Managed. Something I do the way you eat breakfast. Not something I hunt for sport, whatever the stories imply." He looked at her directly now, and there was something almost defensive in it, like this particular misconception mattered to him more than the others. "I've never taken a life for it. Not in 3 centuries. 3 centuries. The number sat in the room between them, enormous and abstract, the kind of number that didn't fit into a sentence without changing the shape of everything around it. Elena tried to imagine 300 years of anything, and failed completely, her own 26 years feeling suddenly small and specific by comparison. "What was the city like," she asked, "when you were my age? However old that actually was for you." Something shifted in his expression, softer, further away, like he was looking through the fire into an entirely different room. Smaller, darker at night in a way this city never gets dark anymore. No electric light anywhere, just candles and torches and the moon when it bothered to show up. People died of things that seem almost insulting now. Small infections, bad water. I watched a lot of people die young who shouldn't have. That must have been strange. Watching everyone around you age, and you didn't. It was the loneliest part, he admitted, quieter now, some of the careful composure slipping. Still is. Most days. You learn not to get attached the way you used to, because attachment costs more than it used to when everyone you love has an expiration date you don't share. Elena felt something twist gently in her chest at that, an ache she hadn't expected to feel toward a man she'd known for 3 weeks. Is that why you don't sleep? Too much time to think about that. Partly, he looked at her again. Careful, deliberate. Mostly I don't sleep because there's rarely a reason to. Nothing waiting for me on the other side of it that I couldn't do awake. That's sad. It's just true. I stopped finding it sad a long time ago. Mostly, something flickered across his face. Brief, and he didn't finish the thought. Letting mostly hang there, the way he let most sentences trail toward something he wasn't ready to say directly. Why tell me all this? Elena asked. You could have kept pretending. I probably wouldn't have figured it out for months. Because you'd have figured it out eventually, and I didn't want the moment you found out to be an accident. I wanted it to be a choice, mine, offered honestly, not something you stumbled into and had to forgive me for hiding. He said it simply, without performance, and something about the plainness of it landed harder than a more dramatic version might have. That's very considerate for someone whose reputation apparently involves whispered warnings. I've had 300 years to learn what considerate looks like. I'm not always good at it. I try. Elena studied him for a long moment, the fire throwing shifting light across the sharp lines of his face, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that the fear she'd expected to feel simply hadn't arrived in any lasting way. What remained instead was something closer to fascination, edged carefully with caution, the two feelings sitting side by side without canceling each other out. I'm not running, she said, in case that's what you're waiting for. Something in his shoulders eased, almost imperceptibly, like a held breath finally let go. I wasn't sure, he admitted. I've told people before, not often. Most of them ran eventually, even the ones who stayed at first. I'm not most people. No, Kyle said quietly, watching her with something that had stopped being merely careful and started being something warmer. I'm beginning to understand that. They sat a while longer without speaking, the fire settling into low, steady light, and Elena found she didn't mind the quiet, the way she usually minded silences, with people she barely knew. With Kyle, the silence didn't feel like something that needed filling. It felt like part of the conversation, another way of saying things neither of them had words for yet. Can I ask one more easy one? She said eventually. You can ask whatever you want. Does Marguerite know everything? About what you are? She's known for 15 years. Longer than most humans stay in my life at all. Something almost fond crossed his face. She found out the way most people do, by accident, at exactly the wrong moment, and she stayed anyway. I've never fully understood why, but I've stopped questioning the good things too closely. It's a habit I'm still learning. The weeks after that settled into something Elena hadn't expected, a rhythm that felt less like dating a stranger and more like slowly moving into a life that had been waiting, half-furnished, for someone to arrive and finish arranging it. She kept her apartment on Ashford, kept her shifts at the diner because KL never once suggested she quit, never treated her independence like something to be quietly dismantled in exchange for comfort. You could stop working there, he said once, not pushing, just observing, the way he observed most things. I know I could. Elena didn't look up from the book she was reading, curled into the same chair by the fire she'd claimed as hers, without either of them deciding it formally. I'm not going to, though. I like having something that's mine. Something that doesn't depend on you. Something in his expression suggested he'd expected that answer, and respected it more for having expected it. That's fair, he said. I wasn't trying to take it from you. I know. That's why I'm not upset about the offer. He'd started leaving small things around the house that felt, in retrospect, less like small things and more like careful preparation. A specific brand of tea she'd mentioned once, stocked in the kitchen without comment. A blanket, heavier than the others, left folded over the back of her chair the week the weather turned properly cold. None of it announced itself as significant. All of it added up, slowly, into a picture of someone paying much closer attention than he let on. She found the notebook by accident, the way most important discoveries in that house seemed to happen, tucked half open on the desk in his study when she came in to return a book she'd borrowed. She hadn't meant to look. But his handwriting caught her eye first, precise and slightly angular, and the heading at the top of the open page stopped her before she could look away. Things that frighten E. Things I should not do. Things I should remember. Beneath it, a list. Numbered, careful, cold hands, mentioned before touching. Doesn't like being watched while she eats. Sit across, not beside, until she's comfortable. Prefers direct answers, even uncomfortable ones, over careful evasions. Do not assume she needs saving from things she hasn't asked to be saved from. Elena stood there for a long moment, the book she'd come to return forgotten in her hand, reading the list twice, then a third time, feeling something rise in her chest that didn't have an easy name. "You're not supposed to see that," Kyle said from the doorway, and she hadn't heard him arrive, which still unsettled her occasionally, how silently he moved when he wanted to. "I wasn't looking for it," she said, setting the book down carefully. "It was just open." "I know." He came further into the room, not defensive exactly, more resigned, like a man who'd known this moment would arrive eventually and had simply hoped for more warning. "I write things down. It helps me remember what matters without getting it wrong. You wrote a list about me. I write lists about everything that matters. Territory disputes. Household accounts. You," he said it plainly, without embarrassment, though something in his posture suggested the plainness cost him something. "I didn't want to get this wrong. I've gotten things wrong before, with people I cared about, and I didn't want that to happen again. Not with you." Elena looked at the list again, at the specific, careful attention behind each line. Do not assume she needs saving, prefers direct answers, even uncomfortable ones, and felt something in her chest loosen in a way she hadn't expected walking into the room. "This is the least creepy way anyone's ever kept notes on me," she said finally, and something in his shoulders eased at the joke, like he'd been braced for a very different reaction. "I'm glad you think so. I wasn't entirely sure how it would land. It lands like someone trying very hard not to hurt me," Elena said, quieter now. "That's not creepy. That's just careful." Kyle was quiet for a moment, watching her with an expression she was starting to recognize, the one that meant he was deciding how much to let show. "I've been careful with a lot of things in 300 years, he said. "I don't think I've been this careful with anyone in a very long time." How long? Long enough that I'd stopped expecting to feel this way again at all. Alana crossed the small distance between them and picked up the notebook herself, turning to a blank page near the back, and held out the pen sitting beside it. "Add one more line," she said. He took the pen, uncertain. What line? "She doesn't need the list to know you're trying." She watched him write it, slow and careful, his handwriting exactly as precise as every other word he'd ever written down, and something about watching him add that particular sentence to a list meant entirely for himself, made the moment feel larger than either of them had probably planned for it to be. When he finished, he set the pen down and looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything, the fire in the study crackling low behind him, the whole house quiet around them the way it always seemed to be at that hour. "I don't know how to say things like this well," he admitted. "I've had 3 centuries and I still don't have the right words most of the time." "You just did," Elena said. "You wrote them down instead. That works too." Something in his face shifted then, open in a way she hadn't quite seen from him before, unguarded for just a moment before the careful composure settled back into place, though not entirely, not the way it used to. She noticed the difference and filed it away quietly, the way she filed away most things that mattered, without saying so out loud. Not yet. The woman arrived without warning on a Thursday evening, the kind of arrival that announced itself through the sudden shift in the house's atmosphere, before anyone said a single word. Elena felt it before she understood it, Marguerite's posture straightening in the hallway, the air itself seeming to grow more careful. And then the door opened, and a vampire Elena had never seen before walked in like she owned the floor beneath her feet. She was beautiful in a way that felt almost aggressive, dark hair falling in a sheet down her back, pale skin, red lips that curved into something that wasn't quite a smile when she saw Elena standing near the fireplace. "So this is her," the woman said, addressing Kael without acknowledging Elena directly, the way you'd discuss furniture in front of the person selling it. "The human." I'd heard rumors. I didn't quite believe them. "Celine," Kael said, and something in his voice had gone carefully flat, the tone Elena recognized now as the one he used when he was working to keep something else entirely out of it. "You could have called ahead. I could have. I chose not to. You've been ignoring my calls for 3 weeks, which is unusual for you, and I wanted to see why in person." Her eyes moved to Elena then, slow, assessing, the kind of look that cataloged and dismissed in the same motion. "I see why now, I suppose, though I confess I'm struggling with the appeal." Elena felt heat rise in her face, not from embarrassment exactly, closer to something sharper, and she made herself hold the woman's gaze rather than look away. "I'm Elena," she said, because introducing herself felt like the only weapon available in a conversation that clearly wasn't going to be fair. "I know who you are. Everyone in the circle knows who you are, by now." Kael's little human project. Celine's tone was pleasant, almost warm, which somehow made it worse. He does this occasionally. Finds someone fragile and interesting, and devotes himself entirely for a season. And then time does what time does, and he moves on, and they're left older and confused about what happened. "That's not what's happening," Kael said, his voice low, controlled, though something underneath it had sharpened considerably. "Isn't it? It's certainly what happened with me." Celine's gaze didn't leave Elena's face. 50 years, in my case. He was very devoted, very careful. And then one day the devotion simply stopped, the way it always does, because we outlast everything eventually. And eventually the fragile things stop being interesting. "That's enough," Kael said, and the flatness in his voice had dropped away entirely now, replaced by something with real weight behind it. "Is it not true? It's not the whole truth, and you know that." He moved to stand slightly closer to Elena, not dramatically, just present, a shift in position that said more than the words that followed. "What ended between us ended because I confused loyalty for something it wasn't, and I told you that honestly when it happened. I won't apologize again for something I already apologized for once." Celine studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind her expression, and then, unexpectedly, some of the sharpness in her posture eased, replaced by something closer to tiredness. "You're serious about her?" "Yes, after 3 weeks. After longer than that if I'm honest about when it actually started." He glanced at Elena briefly, something warm crossing his face despite the tension in the room. "I didn't come looking for this. I wasn't trying to replace anything. It simply happened, the way real things sometimes do, without asking permission first." Celine was quiet for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted into an assessment that felt, for the first time, less hostile and more genuinely curious. "She clocked your license plate before getting in the car," she said finally, and it took Elena a moment to realize this was somehow public knowledge, the story already circulating through whatever circle Celine belonged to. That's what Marguerite told the council, apparently. That's an unusual detail for people to be discussing. "I don't know why that's relevant," Elena said, feeling suddenly exposed by the fact that a stranger from a world she barely understood had already heard details about her own life secondhand. "It's relevant because careful people don't fall for foolish reasons, and Kael has a long history of falling for foolish reasons." Celine's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite warmth, but wasn't hostility either. "I came here angry, and I'm leaving less angry than I arrived. which is unusual for me. That's either a testament to you, or evidence that I'm simply getting tired of being angry at him. I haven't decided which. She turned to leave, pausing at the door with her hand on the frame, the same deliberate pause Elena had learned to associate with people in this world who wanted their exits to mean something. "Be careful with him," Celine said, not unkindly. "He doesn't give himself easily, and he doesn't recover well when it's taken back." I'd know. Then she was gone, the door closing with a quiet finality, and the house seemed to exhale around them, the careful tension dissolving slowly back into ordinary silence. "That was Isadora's replacement in the political sense," Kyle said finally. "Celine sits on matters involving the Eastern Territories. I owed her a conversation I'd been avoiding, and apparently she decided to have it here instead of waiting. She said 50 years. It was real, once. It isn't anymore, and hasn't been for longer than she'd like to admit." He looked at Elena carefully, gauging something. "Are you all right?" "I'm processing," Elena admitted. "Give me a minute." "Take as long as you need," Kael said quietly, and stayed exactly where he was, close but not crowding her, giving her the space to arrive at whatever she needed to arrive at, without rushing any part of it. Kyle's mother arrived 2 weeks later, and unlike Celine, she gave warning first, a short note delivered by hand that simply read, "Arriving Tuesday. Don't rearrange anything on my account." Elena had asked what she should expect, and Kyle had thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Honesty," he said finally. "She doesn't do anything else particularly well." Her name was Iset, and she arrived precisely at the hour the note had promised, tall, silver-haired, despite whatever version of aging vampires actually experienced, dressed simply in dark blue, that somehow made everything around her look slightly underdressed by comparison. She looked at Elena for a long moment in the doorway before saying anything at all, the kind of look that assessed and filed and reserved judgment simultaneously. "You're the one from the car," Iset said. It wasn't quite a question. "I am," Elena said, holding her gaze, because she'd learned by now that this particular family responded better to steadiness than to deference. "Marguerite told me you clocked the license plate before getting in." Something almost like approval flickered at the corner of Iset's mouth. "Good instinct. Most people don't think to protect themselves in situations exactly like that one. Foolish and careful aren't supposed to coexist, and yet, apparently, they can." "I try to hold on to both," Alana said. Iset moved past her into the sitting room without further comment, settling into the chair by the fire with the ease of someone who had claimed that particular chair many times before Elena had ever set foot in the house. Kael hovered near the doorway, and Elena noticed something in his posture she hadn't seen from him before, a kind of careful deference that made him look, for the first time since she'd met him, genuinely young. "He wrote you a list," Iset said, once Elena had sat down across from her. Marguerite mentioned it. "He's never done that before. Not with anyone." "I saw it," Elena admitted. "By accident. He's never written lists about people. Only problems. Territory disputes, financial complications, things with clean solutions if you're patient enough." Iset studied her son for a long moment, something complicated passing across her face. "A list about a person means he's decided you're not a problem to be solved. You're something else entirely to him. I'm aware it matters," Elena said quietly. "I don't take it lightly." "Good. You shouldn't." Iset's tone sharpened slightly, though not unkindly. "He doesn't give himself easily, and he's been hurt badly enough, in ways that took decades to recover from, that I've watched him build careful distances around himself as a kind of permanent architecture. If you're not serious about this, better to say so now than after he's dismantled something he spent a century building." "I'm serious," Alana said, and found, to her own mild surprise, that the words came out steady and certain, without hesitation. I don't know exactly what this is yet, or where it's going, but I know it's not something I'm treating lightly. I haven't been able to treat it lightly since the night he stopped the car. Something shifted in Isette's expression, a kind of careful recalibration, and she nodded once, slow, the same decisive nod Elena had noticed Kael doing when he'd settled something in his own mind. Good, she said again, and this time it carried more weight than the first. She stayed for 2 hours, and the conversation loosened considerably after that initial exchange, drifting into stories about Kael as a younger vampire, stubborn and impatient in ways that didn't entirely match the careful, measured man Alana had come to know. He'd once refused to speak to his own counsel for a month over a matter of principle that turned out, decades later, to have been entirely correct. He'd learned to ride centuries ago and been thrown repeatedly and simply gotten back on each time without acknowledging failure as a concept worth entertaining. He hasn't changed much, Isette said, glancing toward her son with something warm beneath the dry humor. Just slower to anger these days. And apparently capable of writing lists, which is new. I have ears, Kael said from across the room. I can hear you both discussing me like I've left the building. We know, Isette said, unbothered. It's more efficient this way. When she finally rose to leave, she paused at the doorway, the same deliberate pause Elena was learning to recognize as significant in this particular family, and looked back at her directly. He loves you, Isette said simply. I've watched him love exactly one other time in 3 centuries, and it didn't end well, and I watched what that cost him. Whatever you decide to do with what he's giving you, be honest with him about it. He can survive almost anything except being lied to by someone he's chosen to trust completely. I will be, Elena said. I promise. Isette studied her a moment longer, then nodded, satisfied, and left without further ceremony. Kael crossed the room once the door closed behind her and sat beside Elena, close now, closer than he usually allowed himself in front of anyone else. That went better than I expected, he said. She's terrifying. She's had 300 years to perfect it. Something soft entered his voice. She also doesn't approve of things lightly. If she's satisfied, that matters more than I probably know how to explain properly. Elena leaned into him slightly, feeling the cool solidity of him beside her, no longer strange, no longer unsettling, just familiar in a way that had crept up on her slowly over the past month, without her fully noticing, until it had already happened completely. Your mother scares me slightly less than Celine, Elena said eventually, but only slightly. She'd take that as a compliment, Kael said, something warm in his voice. She spent 3 centuries not particularly caring whether people find her comfortable. I noticed. You handled her well. Better than most people manage on a first meeting. He looked down at her. Careful. Steady. I wasn't sure how today would go. I'm relieved it went the way it did. Winter settled fully over the city in the weeks that followed, and Elena found herself splitting her life cleanly between 2 versions of it. The diner and Ashford on one side, the quiet stone house behind the iron gates on the other, and somewhere in the space between them. A version of herself that belonged fully to neither, and increasingly to both at once. She still worked her shifts. Marcus still extended them without asking, though he'd started doing it slightly less often, ever since a very calm, very well-dressed man had come in one evening and quietly informed him that the diner's lease renewal next year might depend on whether its employees were treated fairly, and Marcus had gone pale in a way Elena found deeply satisfying, without asking too many questions about how. Exactly the 2 things were connected. You didn't have to do that, she'd told Kael afterward. I didn't do anything, he said, entirely too innocently for someone whose expression suggested otherwise. I simply had a conversation about lease terms. Business, as I said before. That's a very convenient coincidence. I've learned that coincidences are more efficient than confrontations. Most of the time. She let it go. mostly because some small, tired part of her had wanted exactly that outcome for months and hadn't had the leverage to make it happen herself, and there was something quietly satisfying about being cared for in ways that didn't require her to ask. The nights she stayed at the house had become a kind of ritual of their own. Dinner brought to the library instead of the formal dining room, because Elena had confessed early on that the long table with its rows of empty chairs made her feel like she was eating in a museum. Kyle reading across from her, a book always within reach, his hand occasionally finding hers without either of them commenting on it, natural in a way that had crept up slowly enough that neither could name the exact evening it had started. "Can I ask you something?" Elena said one such evening, the fire burning low, snow beginning outside the tall windows, soft and silent. "Always, Isidora." Celine mentioned her once, in passing. Was that real? Kyle set his book down slowly, considering the question with the same careful weight he gave everything. It was real, for a long time. 50 years, give or take. I confused constancy for love, for most of it. It took ending badly for me to understand the difference. What's the difference? Constancy is choosing to stay because leaving feels harder. Love is choosing to stay because you can't imagine wanting anything else. He looked at her directly, something unguarded in his expression. I understood the difference properly for the first time the night I stopped the car on Kessler. I didn't recognize it immediately. It took weeks to understand what I was actually feeling instead of simply naming it curiosity. Elena felt something warm settle in her chest, slow and certain. That's a very precise way to describe falling for someone. I've had 3 centuries to become precise about very little else that matters. I might as well use the skill here. Something almost like a smile appeared, small, reluctant, the same one she'd first seen in the car. Is that too clinical an answer? No, Elena said. It's exactly right, actually. They sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of comfortable quiet that had become, over the past weeks, one of her favorite parts of any evening spent in that house. She thought about her mother, gone 2 years now, and wondered not for the first time what she would have made of any of this. A daughter falling for a man who'd survived 3 centuries, who kept careful lists about her comfort, who'd quietly fixed a lease dispute without admitting to it directly. "I think she would have liked you," Elena said out loud, not entirely meaning to. "Who?" "My mother." Elena looked at the fire instead of at him, the way he often did when saying something that cost him something. She had a rule about people. She said you could tell everything you needed to know about someone by watching what they did when nobody was checking. You've been doing careful, quiet things for months that nobody was checking on. The lease, the rent that first night, the tea you can't even drink stocked in the kitchen because I mentioned it once. I remember all of it, K.L. said quietly. I remember most things you've mentioned. Actually, it's not entirely a choice. Once something matters, I don't seem able to let it go the way I let go of most things. That sounds exhausting. It's the opposite, with you. It's the easiest thing I've done in longer than I can accurately measure. He reached over and took her hand properly this time. Not the incidental brush from before, but something deliberate, and Elena let him, feeling the cool steadiness of his fingers against hers. I've been trying to figure out how to say something for a while now, Elena admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. I keep starting the sentence in my head and losing my nerve halfway through. You don't have to lose your nerve with me. I promise the answer, whatever it is, won't cost you anything. Elena looked at him, at the fire throwing warm light across features she'd come to know as carefully as her own reflection, and found that the sentence, once she actually reached for it, wasn't nearly as difficult to say as she'd been imagining for the past 2 weeks. I love you, she said. I think I have for a while now. I just kept waiting for the fear to catch up and cancel it out, and it never did. It just got quieter, until this was all that was left. Kyle went completely still, the particular stillness Elena had learned to recognize as something entirely different from calm. The stillness of a man absorbing something too large to process while moving at the same time. For a moment he didn't say anything at all, and she felt a small flicker of panic that she'd misjudged the moment, said too much too soon, until she saw his expression shift underneath the stillness. Something breaking open, slowly. "Say that again," he said. Quiet. Careful. "I love you," Elena repeated, steadier this time. "I'm not saying it because I need you to say it back. I'm saying it because it's true, and I didn't want to keep carrying it around without telling you. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you the same thing for almost a month," Kale said, and something in his voice had roughened slightly, lost some of its careful precision. "I kept deciding it was too soon, and then deciding it had already been true for longer than felt reasonable to admit, and going back and forth without landing anywhere useful." "How long?" Alana asked, echoing the question she'd asked once before, in a different context, about a different kind of number entirely. He considered it with the same seriousness he gave everything. "The night in the study. When you found the list and didn't run." "I think it was already true before that, if I'm honest. But that was the moment I stopped being able to pretend otherwise to myself." Elena felt her chest tighten in the best possible way, the specific ache of hearing something she hadn't fully let herself hope for, confirmed out loud. "That's a very precise memory for something you claim you didn't want to admit yet. I told you. I remember everything that matters. I don't seem to have a choice about it anymore. Not with you." He reached up and touched her face carefully, the same deliberate gentleness she'd noticed from the very beginning, like tenderness was a skill he'd had to relearn from scratch and was determined to practice correctly. "I love you, Elena. I loved you the night you clocked my license plate before deciding to trust me anyway. I loved you when you argued that Marcus owed you those hours, even though you never said it directly. I could see it in how tired you were of being taken advantage of. I love you now, sitting in my library, telling me something I didn't think I'd ever hear again from anyone, and meaning every word of it." She didn't try to stop the tears this time, didn't blink them back the way she usually did, and he noticed, brushing one away with his thumb, gentle, unhurried. "I'm not going anywhere," Elena said, "in case that's the part you're still bracing for. I'm always bracing for it. A little. 3 centuries teaches you to expect endings even in the middle of beginnings." Something almost like a real laugh escaped him, brief and startled by its own existence. "I'm working on unlearning that. Slowly. Take your time. I'm not in a hurry." "That's fortunate," Kyle said, "because I suspect unlearning 300 years of habits might take slightly longer than either of us would prefer." They sat together for a long while after that, the fire burning low, snow continuing to fall silently beyond the windows, and neither of them felt any particular urgency to fill the silence with more words. The way the moment itself seemed to hold everything necessary without additional explanation. "What happens now?" Elena asked eventually, echoing a question that felt older than the moment itself, the kind of question every version of this story eventually arrived at. "Now we have dinner properly, since you barely touched yours." A pause, warmer than the words alone suggested, and then we figure out what the rest of this looks like. Together, slowly, the way we've done everything so far. I'm not interested in rushing something I intend to have for a very long time. That's very practical of you. I'm a practical person, generally. Except, apparently, when it comes to you, where I've discovered I'm considerably less practical than I assumed. He pulled her closer, careful, deliberate, and Elena settled against him, feeling the steady, cool solidity that had once been strange and had become, somewhere in the past 2 months, simply home. "I want to meet your sister eventually," KL said quietly after a while. properly, not as a secret you're managing. Elena looked up at him, surprised by the specificity of it. You remembered Rachel. I remember everything that matters, he said again, and this time it wasn't just a statement of fact. It carried the full weight of everything he'd just told her, everything the past months had built between them, careful and slow, and entirely real. She's going to have a lot of questions. I've survived 3 centuries of political councils and territorial disputes, Cale said, something dry and warm threading through his voice. I imagine I can survive one protective older sister asking difficult questions over dinner. Elena laughed, the sound surprising, even herself, with how easily it came now, how far she'd traveled from the woman standing at a bus stop with $11 and a hole in her shoe, counting streetlights to keep her mind from spiraling into panic. That woman hadn't known yet that the car that stopped that night would become the entire shape of her life going forward, steady and strange and impossibly exactly right. I mean it, Cale said, quieter now, watching her with something settled and certain in his expression. Whatever this becomes, I want it built on things that are real. Your sister. Your life on Ashford. All of it, not just the parts that fit easily into mine. I know, Elena said, and found she believed it completely, without the smallest edge of doubt trailing behind the words. Spring came late to the city that year, the snow holding on stubbornly in shaded corners long after the calendar insisted it should have melted. But it came eventually, the way most good things arrived in Elena's life now. Slower than expected, and somehow more solid for the wait. She kept her shifts at the diner through the whole winter, kept the apartment on Ashford even after most of her nights had quietly relocated to the house behind the iron gates, because some independence mattered too much to fully surrender, and Cale had never asked her to. Rachel met him in March over dinner that lasted 4 hours and ended with her sister pulling Elena aside in the kitchen to whisper, fiercely, that whatever he was, he clearly adored her, and that was enough for Rachel to stop asking questions she didn't strictly need answered. The notebook stayed on his desk, filled slowly with more lines than the original list had ever held, most of them no longer about fear at all. Elena found new entries occasionally, added without announcement. Likes the window seat in the library best in the mornings. Laughs loudest at things she doesn't expect to find funny. Chose to stay, every day since, without needing to be asked twice. She thought sometimes about the version of herself that had stood at that broken bus stop counting streetlights, $11 short of 14, certain the night would end the way most of her nights ended, cold and small and unremarkable. She never told that version of herself what was coming, because there hadn't been any way to know. No warning that a car would slow down behind her and change the entire shape of everything that followed. She knew now what Cale had meant, that first night, about noticing being easier than caring. He'd noticed her from a parked car outside a pharmacy. But it was the caring that stayed, patient and careful and written down in a hand that never stopped trying to get the details right, page after page, for as long as either of them had left to fill them. If this story made you feel something real, follow for more new stories every week.